Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chrissy Bradshaw from Porzio. We are presenting the Transparency Forecast Sunshine Ahead session today. We have a lot of information to cover. As everybody knows, the regulations were quite a book, so we're going to move quickly and try and get through a lot of information. Some of you have asked about slides. We're happy to send out slides after the presentation. For any of you that are subscribers to the Porzio Compliance Digest, you can go on to the digest and click on the presentations link on the left side of the page. The deck has been loaded, so it is there now if you would like to access it during the presentation. So as I said, this is Chrissy Bradshaw. With me is Sarah Canberg. We both work with Porzio Life Sciences here in Morristown, New Jersey. And we're heavily involved with aggregate spend, both on the compliance side and on the actual data collection and reporting side. We're also both attorneys with Porzio, Bromberg, and Newman. And we know a lot of you, and we're happy to have a lot of new names in our audience as well today. As we go through the deck, please feel free to add questions. You have a little questions box in the GoToMeeting panel. So you can type questions in there and submit them. We're going to try and get through questions if we have time at the end. If we run out of time, we will follow up with everybody after the presentation. So we'll try and get back to everyone with answers as best we can. We don't have all the answers, but we'll do what we can. Okay. So here's our agenda for today. We'll do a very quick background. At this point, everybody is pretty aware of what's been happening. And then from there, we're going to go through sort of the big questions with respect to the Sunshine Act. Not quite in normal order. We're going to start with the why and then go through who's required to report and who are we reporting payments to. What's required, so we have a couple different reports that we're filing and a lot of information about what goes on those reports. We're going to talk about when, so there are several different dates that are impacted, and we all know that we're delayed at this point, so when do things kick in and when will CMS have responsibilities? The where, so where is all this information going? And then how. So how do we actually do these reports, and then how do we go through the dispute process, which of course is a big issue for a lot of companies and the covered recipients too. Okay.
Good afternoon, this is Sarah Canberg. As Chrissy said, we all know the background of the Sunshine Act, but we're going to step back in time a little bit. In March 2010, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act was passed and signed into legislation. Included within the Affordable Care Act was the transparency reports and reporting of physician ownership or investment interest provision, commonly referred to as the Sunshine Act. And that's why we're all here today. The Act has been around since 2010, but we just now have in hand our final regulations. On our next slide, we have the timeline for implementing the Sunshine Act from March 2010. We provide a timeline from March 2010 through March 2014, which is the deadline for the submission of the first reports to CMS. Our timeline includes key dates, the dates we expected to receive the draft regulations, the dates we actually received the draft proposed regulations, and then where we are now, today in February 2013, with the tome of the preamble and final regulations. In April 2013, the final regulations will become effective. In August 2013, data collection will begin for the first reports from August through the end of December. of 2013, with our first reports being due March 31st, 2014. Why are we here today? Why are we concerned with this law? This law is intended to provide transparency between industry and HCPs, physicians, the relationship between industry and physicians. Senator Grassley, as a co-author of the Sunshine Act, has been very vocal from the beginning as he co-authored this law, and has been as anxious as those of us waiting for the regulations to come out. Most recently, Senator Grassley stated, disclosure brings accountability, and accountability will strengthen the credibility of medical research, the marketing of ideas, and ultimately the practice of medicine. So that's why the law is in place.
We had a couple questions about downloading the slides, just in case you just joined us. For those of you who are Porzio Compliance Digest subscribers, you can log in, and on the left side of the screen is a link to presentations. The slide deck is already there, so you could access it and download it there. It's a PDF. For those of you that aren't subscribers, we're happy to get the deck out to you as soon as we're done with the presentation. Okay. Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No problem. So that's the intent behind the law, but why else are we doing this? The penalty provisions are a huge motivator for why companies will be submitting the reports. There are penalties for failure to submit information in a timely and accurate manner, as well as penalties for knowingly failing to submit information. And these two penalties would be aggregated for a total penalty exposure. In addition to the monetary penalties, companies are equally, if not more, concerned with the public exposure of non-compliance and penalties being administered. The Sunshine Act generally requires applicable manufacturers and applicable purchasing organizations to report to CMS any direct or indirect payments or transfer of value provided to a covered recipient, or any payment provided to a third party on behalf of a covered recipient. If that were crystal clear, Chrissy and I would not be joining you today and walking you through the nuances and the definitions of who is an applicable manufacturer, who does the law apply to, what's required to be reported, when, and how must it be reported. So today we're going to do our best to unpack these definitions, share some clarity that CMS provides in the preamble with regard to these definitions. So the first step is, who does the law impact? Applicable manufacturers is a very lengthy definition that includes a lot of qualifiers. The first step is applicable manufacturers are entities that are operating in the United States. The definition of operating in the United States was narrowed from the proposed regulations to the final regulations. In the final regulations, operating in the United States includes entities that are physically located in the United States or are conducting activities within the United States, which includes selling product in the United States. The categories of applicable manufacturers are divided into two categories. Paragraph 1 is an entity that's engaging in production, preparation, propagation, compounding, or conversion of covered product. This is what we typically think of as a manufacturer, entities that hold the FDA approval, hold title to the product. CMS provides some, in the regulation itself, states that distributors and wholesalers that do not hold title to the product are not considered applicable manufacturers. However, the converse, the distributors or wholesalers that do hold title to the product are considered applicable manufacturers under this kind of Category 1 applicable manufacturer. In the preamble, there's also some clarification that the Category 1 applicable manufacturers include contract manufacturers and do not include manufacturers of raw materials or components that are not themselves considered covered products. Moving on to Category 2, applicable manufacturers. These applicable manufacturers are entities that are under common ownership with an entity that is considered an applicable manufacturer in paragraph 1, and these entities provide assistance or support to the applicable manufacturer with respect to production, preparation, propagation, compounding, conversion, marketing, promotion, sale, or distribution of the covered product. From the proposed to the final, there was many comments and concerns with regard to the definition of common ownership. From the proposed to the final, CMS did finalize that common ownership refers to circumstances where the same individuals, entities directly or indirectly own 5% or more total ownership of two entities. Many companies wanted this, or many commenters wanted this to be a larger percentage, but CMS stuck with the 5%. Common ownership also requires that it's a two-prong evaluation, that they own 5% of or more total ownership, and that company provides assistance and support. Assistance and support is clarified and defined as providing a service or services that are necessary or integral to the manufacturer or marketing, promotion, sale, or distribution of the covered product. And so necessary and integral, some of the examples provided by CMS would include an entity that manufactures an active ingredient or an active agent for a covered product. That company would be considered providing necessary or integral services to a applicable manufacturer. An example of services that are not necessary or integral would be human resources support to an applicable manufacturer. So there does need to be a link between the services being provided and the actual manufacturing of the product. And both the requirement to report physician ownership interest is applicable to applicable group purchasing organizations. The same qualifier applies to applicable group purchasing organizations. They must operate in the United States, which is the physical location or activities being conducted in the United States. And the entity purchases, arranges for, or negotiates the purchase of covered drug, device, biological, or medical supply for a group of individuals or entities, but not solely for use by the entity itself. So there is the expectation that it is a group and for resale to others. The preamble provides a clarification that physician-owned distributors are intended within this, to be included within this definition.
Okay, so turning to who are we reporting against, we all know covered recipients are teaching hospitals and physicians. That carried over straight from the statute to the proposed regs to the final regs. We, again, same thing, know that the physicians that are included or physicians that are employees are excluded, but it clarifies that it's employees of the manufacturer who's reporting. So I guess if you happen to be paying an employee of another applicable manufacturer who is a physician, you would have to report against that person. We know from the definition of physician that's in a separate part of the Social Security Act that the definition includes MDs, DOs, DPMs, DDSs, and chiropractors. The proposed or the final regs, I'm sorry, clarified that we're not including residents. CMS basically felt like they would be too hard to track. They probably don't have NPI numbers and all that good stuff, so easier to just keep them out. Something else that was clarified that I know has come up a lot in my experience is physicians who are licensed and may have multiple licenses but don't practice. They work solely in research or have a writing job somewhere. CMS clarified in the regulations or in the preamble to the regulations that the requirement is that the physician have a license, an active license, and there's nothing that limits that. So as long as they have an active license, we need to be collecting and reporting those payments against them, against those individuals, as long as they fall within the other requirements. Another point of clarification, the definition of physician in the Social Security Act talks about physicians being licensed by a state and practicing in a state. And we've had this question a couple times come up over the last couple months, that does that include physicians who are licensed in Puerto Rico or another possession or territory of the U.S.? And the definition of state in the Social Security Act does say that it's the 50 states, of course, plus D.C., Guam, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and possessions and territories of the United States. Okay, teaching hospitals. So it's any institution that receives a payment under these statutes, and those are graduate medical education, independent medical education, and psychiatric hospital independent medical education. They clarified that they'll provide a list. CMS is going to provide a list of the teaching hospitals, and they said that they'll provide it 90 days before the start of the reporting year. For our purposes this year, it should be 90 days before we start collecting data in August. So we should look for that by the beginning of May, we hope. Something else that they clarified was that payments to non-healthcare departments within even a teaching hospital are exempted. I think this is quirky. It's going to be hard to sort of track those. They also said that if the payment does, however, go to a covered recipient as almost like a pass-through payment, those would still be subject to reporting. So just a little quirk to look out for. So turning to what is subject to reporting. The first qualifier, a payment or other transfer of value, obviously very broad. It's a transfer of anything of value. The regulations, the preamble states, actually in the section talking about the nature of the payment, that it's really anything. Everything is subject to reporting unless it's exempted, unless there is some specific exemption or exclusion saying this type of interaction or this type of payment or transfer of value is not subject to reporting. So it's really, like a Vermont. It's very inclusive unless things are specifically exempted. The second part that gets us in is a payment that relates to a covered drug, biologic device, medical supply. So we know that it's something that has payment available under Medicare, Medicaid, or CHIP. They talk about how this can be something that's reimbursed separately, so on its own, or it's part of a bundled payment. They changed the term composite. They switched over to using the term bundled to be a little bit clearer, to provide some clarity in the final regulations. They also said that in addition, so it's an and, for a drug or biological product, it's something that requires a prescription, and for a device or a medical supply, it requires, or a supply that's a device, it requires pre-market approval by the FDA or pre-market notification to the FDA. So it's an and. It has to have both coverage, payment available under a federal program, state program, and it has these approval or licensure requirements with the FDA. Okay, something else that they specified, which I think is great, is they said that for a company that is a new company, maybe you're pre-market now, or you're a company that maybe you've only been in the OTC market or something like that, but during a reporting period you obtain approval, licensure, clearance for a product that now will be covered, you have 180 days to get ready. So if it happens in the middle of the year, you don't have to immediately be ready to start collecting data for reporting. You have 180 days to get ready, get set up, get your systems going, and start collecting data to be reported at the next, the next March, whenever that is.
And that 180 days mirrors the 180 days that all currently applicable manufacturers have from now until August 1st.
Right, which was nice of them. They originally said 90 days, so we are fortunate in having an extra couple months there. So just to be clear, the general rule is that when you have one covered drug, device, biological, medical supply, you're all in. So if you have one thing that's subject to that reporting that has that met those qualifications we just talked about, you have to report everything, every payment that relates to any product that you have, whether it's or doesn't even relate to a product, anything that goes to a covered recipient. In the final regulations, they clarified that there are some exceptions to that. There was a lot of commentary submitted about how that's really burdensome for some companies and just a very difficult model for some entities, maybe not even a true drug or device manufacturer as we might think of them. So CMS put some limits on it. There are 4 major ones. The first one is that applicable manufacturers that has a total or gross revenue from covered products. So when we talk about covered products at any point, we're talking about a drug, device, biologic, or medical supply. So gross revenue that constitutes less than 10% of their total gross revenue during the prior fiscal year. You only have to report your payments or transfers of value that relate to those covered products. Second limitation, or the second scenario that gives you the limited reporting, is when you are a quote-unquote applicable manufacturer, but under that common ownership paragraph. So that second paragraph where you have a common ownership with an applicable manufacturer and you provide assistance or support that's integral to the manufacturing of the product. Those entities are only having to report the payments related to covered products. Third scenario is where an applicable manufacturer has unique or distinct operating divisions that don't produce any covered products. So the example they give is related to an animal health division. Those divisions would only be required to include payments that relate to the covered products. Fourth example is really the contract manufacturer scenario. So Sarah mentioned that those entities are under the manufacturer definition, but CMS said that if they're a contract manufacturer, they don't have the FDA approval, licensure, clearance, etc., and they're not involved at all in the sale, marketing, distribution of the product, those entities too only have to report the payments that relate to the covered products. Okay, so now moving into what are we actually submitting. We have 2 reports that we're submitting, sort of. We now have a sort of third report. So we have a payment or transfer of value report, so that's a lot, the big volume of everything we'll be talking about. CMS clarified here, though, that we're going to report the research-related payments separately. So same report format, basically, but there are a couple extra things, a couple different things that will go into that actual file. And then we have our physician ownership and investment interest report. So that's where the GPOs come into play. And we'll talk about how the definition of a covered recipient is a little bit different for that report as well. So getting into the details, what is required on these reports? So the first report, the payment and other transfer of value report. So there are a lot of details that were provided in these final regs. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try and highlight some of the more quirky and the interesting things that came up in the preamble here and in the final regulations. So we know we have to include the covered recipient's name. For a physician, a middle initial is required if one exists. So if one is in the NPPES database, it should be on the report. And another thing that they specified is that the name needs to come from the NPPES database. So it needs to look like it looks in NPPES. For those of you that have reported in Massachusetts, same concept, right? So we have in Massachusetts a covered recipient list, and on the report for Massachusetts, we're supposed to be using the name as it appears in that list. So for those of you that have a system, you need to be able to tie them together so that you're getting the right version of the name. For those of you that don't have a system, you want to be pulling the name, you know, copy paste basically from that database. For the business address, they specified that you don't have to use the NPPES database. You can use your own internal records. So, you know, you have a customer master and your SFA, whatever it is. But it does have to be the primary practice address. That's what they want. That's a term that's in NPPES. I think we all get what that means. But CMS recognized in the regs that we may not know what the primary address is. They might have a couple business addresses. So they said that we won't be penalized as long as we provide an actual full business address. So, you know, to the extent you can make sure you're not submitting the physician's home address, that should be, you know, something we all need to check. I'm not sure how we would even go about that, but we're looking for a business address. The specialty, so there are a couple things that are specific to physicians. Specialty is one of them. Again, this is one thing that CMS said can come from our own internal records. This was something that we had thought could be problematic from a promotional off-label marketing standpoint if a physician registered in the NPPES database 20 years ago and has since you know, changed their specialty or has a much narrower specialty now or something like that. We would want to be able to use the specialty as we know it, not necessarily as CMS has it. So you can use your own. The quirk here is that it has to look like it would look in NPPES. So if there's 100 different specialties that are included in NPPES, and I'm pretty sure it's a lot more than that, the value that you include in your report needs to be the same. You know, so if it's oncology-pediatrics in NPPES, you can't include pediatric oncology. And I don't know what it actually says in NPPES, just an example. Another thing that they mentioned is that not only do you need to include the name of the specialty, you know, it written out, you need to include the code, the taxonomy code that they use in, you know, that CMS uses in that NPPES database. So really, we need to be able to tie to that database to pull this information. And they said that the NPI is required for physicians if one exists. They're going to, they said that the NPPES database can basically be used as of 90 days before the reporting period starts. So, you know, they of course said in the regulations that it's updated constantly and there's always new information, but as long as you're reporting accurately as of that 90-day mark, it sounds like they won't penalize anybody. Another thing that was added was state license number and a state of licensure for physicians, and you can include up to 5, but you have to include at least 1. Okay, most companies, at least on the drug side, have this from the sampling perspective. A lot of device companies may not have this, and this is something that, you know, you would need to get from a customer master from some kind of database. Okay, we have a physician owner or investor flag on this report. We'll talk about that ownership report, but CMS says they don't want things duplicated. So if it can be put on this report, it should be, and there's a yes or no indication basically saying this physician is an owner or investor. The amount of the payment, so this is not too much was given on this one. We're looking at basically fair market value. It's supposed to include all aspects of the payment or transfer of value, so they talk about including shipping costs, taxes, those kinds of things. The date, so the date is something that they had proposed we could report as a single as individual line items for every payment, or if things are related to each other, we could group them and report the date as the first date of the first payment, so that's still an option. We can also choose to report basically the activity date, like the date of a flight, or the payment date, the date that the flight was purchased. But what CMS does say in the preamble is that they need you to be consistent within a nature. So if we're talking, the travel nature, we need to either pick the activity date or pick the payment date and be consistent. So we have the form and the nature, and Sarah's going to give us a lot more information on those, so I'm not going to spend any time on them. The recipient is a little quirky. This is something where maybe a physician or a teaching hospital received the payment somehow, maybe as a pass-through, maybe as an indirect payment, but we need to include someone else or another entity. And in some cases, we're reporting another entity's name. They also said, though, that we wouldn't have to report another individual's name. If that individual is not a covered recipient, we would just be able to literally put individual in that field to acknowledge that the payment involves someone else, but not identify that particular person. So the product is another area where we got a lot of clarification. So we're including the product name whenever a payment or transfer of value relates to a product. So if one exists, you have to have it on there. You can include up to 5. So if there are 5, if they're up to 5, you would list them all. If there are more than 5, you need to pick the 5 most relevant to the payment or transfer of value. They clarified what name we're using. So for drugs and biologicals, it's the marketed name and the NDC code if one exists, or you can use the name that's registered on clinicaltrials.gov. For devices and medical supplies, again, you can use the marketed name. You can also use the therapeutic area or the product category, which CMS thinks will be more recognizable by consumers, by patients. If a payment is not related to a covered product but is related to a product, so something else that the manufacturer has, you want to write in the field non-covered product. And then if a payment is related in general to your business but isn't related to any product, covered or otherwise, you're going to put none. Okay, and then the last thing that's on this report is some contextual information. So you're allowed to include what they say is limited. We don't know what limited means. It could be 20 characters. It could be 2,000 characters. It would be a lot, but you never know. And they, basically said that that is for both CMS so that they have an understanding of what we're doing, and particularly for the physician-covered recipients when they come in to look at a payment. This will provide them with some good contextual information when they're reviewing the payments that everyone has submitted.
And going back to what Christy was indicating, payments are required to be indicated as the form of the payment as well as the nature of the payment. CMS took comments in where the commenters were requesting specific definitions be provided for each of the forms of payment and nature of payment. While CMS did not provide specific regulatory definitions, the preamble does provide some definitional clarifications and types of activities they expect to see within the nature of payment specifically. I'm not going to walk through every form of payment or nature of payment, but I intend to focus on those forms of payment and nature of payment that are new or different, have changed from the proposed. Starting with forms of payment, CMS took comments and agreed to break out the stock options, stock options, or other ownership interest from dividend, profit, or other return on investment, recognizing that these are different forms of payment. On the nature of payment, we we see a new value for space rental or facility fees for teaching hospitals only. This is in recognition of specific payments that are going to teaching hospitals from applicable manufacturers and recognizing that relationship. And CMS added new values regarding compensation for serving as faculty or as a speaker for an accredited and an unaccredited continuing education program. So recognizing the value of breaking those two activities out between accredited and unaccredited, and adding clarification with regard to compensation for services other than consulting, including serving as a faculty or a speaker at an event other than a continuing education. And an example that they provide for that is promotional speaking activities. So those are some new values and changes to the values. And one value that they removed from the proposed to the final is they removed the other category. They felt that that was too much of a catch-all, and as Chrissy indicated, all transfer payments or transfers of value are reportable unless specifically excluded and should be reported based on the most applicable nature of payment. And other was identified as an area where the catch-all was a little too broad. So moving on to some additional clarifications and quirks that came from the proposed to final, starting with reporting of food and beverage. The final regulations significantly changed how food and beverage in a group setting are to be reported. CMS confirmed that applicable manufacturers must calculate the value of the meal on a per person value rather than a per covered recipient value. And the per person value would be reported only as against the covered recipients. An example of that would be if lunch was served at a doctor's office with a value of $150 and 10 participants were present, 4 being doctors, covered recipients, and 6 being non-covered recipients, staff members, registered nurses, and so forth. The value of the meal would be divided by the total number of participants. So the per person value would be $15. $15 would be allocated to each of those 4 doctors. So different than some of the state requirements, CMS is not requiring that the total value of the meal be allocated against the physician. So we see this as a common sense approach and an easier approach for customers to track and to allocate. Additionally, CMS confirmed that buffet meals and snacks provided at large-scale conferences or large-scale events are exempted from reporting. So there will be no reporting requirement on those activities. With the nature payment of gift, CMS indicated that gifts may include anything provided to a covered recipient that does not fit into another category. So this is a little bit of a catch-all category. CMS provides an example of a gift would be small trinket items that are above the minimum threshold that would be reported as a gift since they don't fit squarely within another one of the nature categories. But on the contrasting payment or transfer of value is the sporting event tickets. If that type of activity or payment transfer of value is provided to a covered recipient, that would be better categorized as entertainment and would not be categorized as a gift. I will speak about this a little bit later, but CMS does say to request that you utilize the assumptions document to provide clarity or supporting documentation for your methodology for categorizing your payments. So if you wanted to provide clarification of how you are categorizing gifts, the assumptions document would be the opportunity to do so. Chrissy's touched on this a little bit. How do we value what's the value of gifts being provided. CMS indicated that we should use an economic value and not the value to the recipient. So just because the recipient may have the textbook you're giving him and it's theoretically of no value to him or her, there is an economic value, and that's the value that should be captured. CMS also indicates that the value should include tax or shipping in the reported value. But quickly following that statement, CMS states that applicable manufacturers should use reasonable and a good faith effort to determine the value. And again, your evaluation process is an example of something that could be included in your assumptions document. And another clarification with regard to valuation is how types of gifts or payments are allocated. For an example would be if a textbook is provided to a group practice. From the proposed regulations to the final regulations, there was some clarity and some common sense modifications made. If a dermatology textbook is provided to a group practice and there's only 2 dermatologists in that practice, the value of the book should be allocated only to the dermatologist. So there wouldn't be any off-label concerns if it was going to being allocated to inappropriate recipients. Okay, moving on to consulting payments. There are several categories of nature types that include compensation for consulting. A general category is the consulting fee. CMS provides some clarity on what they expect the consulting fee nature category to include. They state that it's provided under a written, that type of payment is provided under a written agreement in response to a legitimate need. So that would be fee for consulting services. Another consulting value is, or nature, is an honoraria. I find this CMS's definition of honoraria particularly unhelpful. They define it in the preamble as generally provided for services for which custom prohibits a price from being set. I think that each company kind of has their own definition of what they consider an honoraria. And again, the assumptions document would be a helpful document to document how each company is defining their honoraria payments that they're categorizing as honoraria payments. And additionally, there are nature categories for compensation for services for other than consulting, the promotional speaking activities, as well as accredited and unaccredited speaking or faculty activities. On that note, while there is a nature value for accredited continuing medical education payments, there is also an exclusion for a payment or transfer value for speaker or faculty of an accredited continuing education program. It must meet these conditions in order for the payment to be exempted. The event must meet the accreditation or certification requirements of one of the 5 specifically listed organizations. The applicable manufacturer must not directly pay the speaker, and the applicable manufacturer must not select or provide a list of potential identified individuals to serve as the speaker for the program. So if these conditions are met, that payment is exempt from reporting. However, if the event qualifies as an accredited program, but the applicable manufacturer either pays the speaker directly or is somehow involved in the selection of the speaker, that payment would still need to be reported, and in that circumstance would be reported as in the nature of an accredited program, whereas if the program were an unaccredited program, it would be reported as an unaccredited program based on that nature.
Okay, so switching a little bit over to the research side, as I mentioned before, we have our payment or other transfer of value report, but now we have this sort of sub-report where we get to include just research-related payments. So CMS in the preamble and in the final regulation clarifies what research means, and this is using the research nature. So there's one of the natures that Sarah listed is actually research, and this is where we're using that. So these are payments made in connection with research that are subject to a written agreement or contract or a research protocol. So part of the regulations clarified that it doesn't have to be both a protocol and a contract, because not all quote-unquote research payments might have both, but one is enough to qualify for this research category. They also use a definition that explains what's included from a practical standpoint. So we're talking about preclinical activities. We're also talking about your regular phases 1 through 4 trials, and then we're talking about investigator-initiated studies as well. One thing that they did specify was that when we're talking about material transfers that they precede, development, something where they really don't have any value, that's exempted from reporting. So you don't have to report those material transfers. And, a big change really from the proposed regulations to the final regulations was in this research area. You probably remember, and many of you may have submitted comments about sort of the convoluted way that we were going to have to report research payments. Some of them would have been reported twice. We would have had to indicate whether it was direct or indirect. We were going to be reporting, huge $100,000 worth of payments to a physician when in reality, just because he's the principal investigator, he was not getting any of that. So obviously a lot of comments submitted. CMS, really, I guess, took them to heart and changed the way we're reporting. So we have to submit, like I said, the data separately. We're only reporting each payment once, which is good. And we're reporting a lot of the same information, a couple of different things. The name is the same idea. One clarification is that we're reporting the name of the recipient, basically, whoever received the payment, whether or not that's a covered recipient. So, the payment could have gone to a clinic or a hospital that's not a teaching hospital. We would still be reporting that. We would be including a name and business address. If it's a teaching hospital, you're using the name and address that CMS is going to provide in its list. If it's an individual, we're including the same information that we would include on the payment and transfer of value report. So, the name, the primary business address, the NPI, the specialty code, the state license number, and the state of licensure, all that good stuff. We also need the principal investigator. So if the payment is going to if the name that we're reporting is a teaching hospital or some other entity, we also have to include the principal investigator or investigators. It said that this is folks who are involved in the research. It might be broader than the individual who's named as the PI, but to the extent that that person is a covered, or those people are covered recipients, we're including them in all those good details with respect to that PI. We have to include a name, the name of the study. We also have to include the names of any covered drugs, devices, biologics, or medical supplies, and the NDC code, if applicable. This is where we would be indicating if this is eligible for delay in publication, and we'll talk about that and some of the quirks behind that. We can include an optional clinicaltrials.gov identifier, and also we can include optional contextual information. Again, same idea that this information might be helpful for the covered recipient, it might be helpful for the public, it'll definitely be helpful for CMS. And then the one that I skipped is the amount. So for the amount on the research front, we're talking about a total aggregated amount, so you don't have to be breaking out individual pieces, individual payments. And basically what CMS says in the preamble is that anything that's included in the contract or in the protocol can be included in that amount, in that aggregated amount. Whereas if payments are made with respect to research, so maybe the same trial or the same study, but they're not part of those payments that are from the protocol. It's, someone brought food in, or they paid for travel expenses of the PI to come in for an investigator meeting or something like that. Those things are going to be reported separately. You can't lump those in to that aggregated number. Okay. We mentioned preclinical activities. Payments are included here as well. So we're talking about activities that relate to studies before human studies. CMS mentions laboratory studies, animal studies. Very limited information here, so we're only reporting the name of the research institution, the total amount of the payment, so same concept. The PI, I think, same information here, the name, address, NPI, all that good stuff. We're not including a product. We're not including a study name. So all of those other pieces are excluded here.
Chrissy, I want to step back a little bit and just get your thoughts on, you indicated that certain payments, certain research payments like travel expenses of the PI, if it's not included in the contract or protocol, are reported separately. That goes on the other payments and transfers of value report or in this research section? It's
a great question. It's a little confusing actually, because in other parts of the regulation or the preamble to the regulation, they talk about same concept, but if you have a consultant, a physician consultant who you're paying a consulting fee to, you're required to break out food, lodging, airfare as travel or as food, as whatever it would qualify as. You can't lump it all together and say, all $2,214 were for the quote-unquote consulting. In the research context, there are things that might be broken out, like we're saying here, the food, the travel, a consulting fee perhaps for someone to come in for a meeting, data safety monitoring board, for example. And while those things have a separate category or a separate nature perhaps, they're still research, as we think of it as research. The way I understand it, the things that are included in this research report are things that qualify to fall under that research nature. So we're talking about there's a contract and a protocol. So to the extent that we have those payments that are qualifying, while they might be separate but still qualify under that definition, maybe we report them as research, as quote-unquote nature, the nature is research, and include them here and just separate them out. But I think we want to be careful about sort of lumping too much into research when really maybe it's not appropriately falling under that research category. It's a great question, though. I don't think it's crystal clear.
Yeah, I think it's an area of further need of further clarification.
Yeah. Okay, so the delayed publication, this is something that those of you who are reporting in Vermont have dealt with a little bit. It's sort of the reverse in Vermont, where you don't have to report it until either the product is approved or 4 years later. In CMS and in the federal requirements, we have to report it as it happens, so each year, just like you would report everything else. But the payments that are flagged appropriately under the requirements here, will not be published. So they won't be put on the public-facing website. What CMS, one thing they clarified is that these payments, even though they won't be published on the website, they will still be available for review during that 45-day review period. They'll still be there for review by you, by the covered recipient, by the teaching hospital or physician, whoever it might be. So there are some requirements for delaying the different payments that you're including on your research report. In particular, we're talking about payments that relate to research and development of a new drug, device, biologic, or medical supply, or a clinical investigation of a new drug, device, biologic, or medical supply. What's not included is payments related to a clinical investigation of an existing drug, device, biologic, medical supply. So, you know, everyone may be doing research on expanded indications, things like that. If it's falling under that clinical investigation definition, it would not be you would not be permitted to, quote unquote, delay it if it's a clinical investigation of an existing, you know, a new use for an existing product. One thing that they clarified here was that for generics, so something being submitted under an ANDA perhaps, those qualify here for the delay. So those would be research on a new product. Another quirk with the delayed publication is that you have to report this every year. So if it happened, you know, if it occurs this fall, say, we'll report it in March of 2014, and you'll indicate a little flag saying, yes, this should be delayed. Next year, we need to say again whether this payment should be delayed. And you can do that, you know, up to, I guess, 4 times, 4 calendar years, unless the product has been approved before that, after which you need to indicate again, here is this payment, and this time it may be published. So no delay, or yes, publish. So that's a quirk. It's something that, for those of you that have systems, need to make sure that that's worked in so that the data is being reviewed and then subsequently included on a report every year until it gets sort of thrown on there to get published. So it's a little tricky, but it's a good thing. It's good. They're protecting privacy, but it does make it a little bit challenging, I think, for the actual logistics of getting the data on the report.
Moving from what is required, we'll move to what is specifically excluded from reporting requirements. This list did not change much from proposed to final, if at all. So we provide a complete list of all the exclusions. I'm going to drill down into some of the more interesting areas based on information provided by CMS in the preamble. I'm first going to start with payments less than $10 unless the aggregate for year exceeds $100. While these payments less than $100 are exempt from reporting unless the aggregate for the year exceeds $100, they do need to be tracked because once the payments exceed, you know, once the payments are $101, all of those payments are eligible and required for reporting. CMS does clarify and provide the opportunity for those payments to either be reported individually as separate line items, or if they are of the same nature, they can be reported in a bundled fashion. So one line item capturing all of those small payments that are of a same nature value. An example of another clarification is small incidental items that are under the $10, such as pens or notepads that are provided at large conferences, are exempted from reporting, but are included including the need for tracking. So they don't need to be tracked and they don't need to be reported. So they will not go towards the $100 aggregate. An additional exclusion category are educational materials. The final regulations expand what types of educational materials are excluded. It's expanded based on the proposed regulations wanted it only to be written materials provided would be exempt. The final regulations clarify that educational materials can include anatomical models or flash drives with materials included on them would be excluded if they are being provided for the benefit of patients. So an example of educational materials that would not be excluded would be educational materials that are provided to a physician for the physician's education. So for an educational material to be exempt, it does need to be provided to a physician for the benefit of the patients. Another area of exclusion are indirect payments. This area is an area of, while they did provide some clarification, it takes a while to drill down to figure out what types of indirect payments are reportable and which are not. Generally, as you know, indirect payments are reportable. An example of that would be payments provided to a third party where the applicable manufacturer requires, instructs, directs, or otherwise causes the third party to provide the payment to a covered recipient. So this would be an example of a pass-through payment where the applicable manufacturer directs the payment to a third party to be provided to a physician or teaching hospital. So the ultimate recipient would be a covered recipient. Those are reportable payments. However, the regulations and statute provide that indirect payments or transfer of value where the applicable manufacturer is unaware of the identity of the covered recipient are excluded from reporting. So the key word there is unaware. If the manufacturer does not know the identity of the covered manufacturer during the reporting year or by the end of the second quarter of the following year, that payment would be exempt. Unaware is defined by the applicable manufacturer knowing or knowingly acting. So the applicable manufacturer would be considered aware of the covered recipient if the applicable manufacturer has actual knowledge of the covered recipient or should have had knowledge. So if they acted in deliberate ignorance or acts in reckless disregard of the truth or falsity of the information, the applicable manufacturer would be deemed to know who the covered recipient was. With that in mind, this puts a burden on the applicable manufacturer to coordinate with the third-party recipient to have the third party communicate back to them who the covered recipient that received the payment is. And that time period will be tricky because if the applicable manufacturer provides the payment in June of, let's use September of 2013, but the third party doesn't provide the payment to the covered recipient until February of 2014, the applicable manufacturer has an obligation to kind of track down that payment and find out who was the ultimate recipient of the payment and then report it in the following calendar year. So the cross-calendar year, I think, will be tricky for us as we move forward with the reporting obligations.
Yeah, and that will look pretty quirky, right? Because then on your March 2015 report, you're going to be reporting a payment that has a date of September in 2013, you know, and from when we talked about penalties and all that, the timeliness is an issue. So I guess CMS will be looking at that, and maybe the context is a great place to include something like that, you know, saying we're not late in submitting this. This is a payment that was an indirect payment that we just found out during the second quarter. As of now, at least, there's nowhere to indicate really that something is indirect and, you know, you have this extra 6-month period to track down the covered recipient.
Right,
so,
there's no flag for that.
Right.
One type of indirect payment that falls squarely within the indirect payment exclusion, and CMS provides a specific example, is when an applicable manufacturer engages a third party to conduct market research. And the intent of engaging that third party is that the covered recipient remains anonymous while the applicable manufacturer presumably could find out who the covered recipient, they're directing that the payment go to a covered recipient. CMS specifically clarified that that type of payment falls within the indirect payment exclusion to preserve the anonymity and respect the purpose of that market research payment.
Okay. Okay, so all of that wonderful information was related to that payment or other transfer of value report and that sub-payment or other transfer of value research report. We can't forget about that pesky little ownership or investment interest report. This is where GPOs come into play. Sarah talked about the definition of a GPO. So those folks have an obligation to include these ownership and investment interests held in the manufacturer or GPO by a physician or an immediate family member of a physician. And the definition of immediate family member, I don't think it changed from the proposed regs to the final regs. So we're talking a pretty broad group of people here. Your spouse, the physician's spouse, a parent, a child, a sibling, a step-parent, stepchild, step-sibling, all your in-laws, your grandparents, your grandchildren, and the spouse of your grandparents or grandchildren. I don't even know who all of those people are in my family, so I'm not sure how you as the manufacturer is supposed to get all that information. The good news is you basically don't. What we know from the final regs is that we have to include a lot of information on the report. Much of it is similar to what we saw on the first report. But we do not have to include the names of family members or even the relation, actually, of a family member holding an investment interest. So really we're reporting the physician and all the good information related to the physician. You know, so we're talking the name, the specialty, the NPI, the license state, the license number, lots of good stuff. And then we're saying yes or no whether this this investment interest is related to that held by a family member of the physician. We have to include the dollar amount invested. This is something where CMS said that you can aggregate across a family, basically. So they said, you know, since you don't have to report all of the names, you may as well be able to report in the aggregate the interests held by this group, this family, set of family members. What they did say, though, is that you can only aggregate if it's an interest with the same terms. You know, so you can, if the family member and the physician have different terms of their ownership interest, they can't be aggregated. You would be essentially reporting to a line item saying physician himself or herself has this interest, and the physician, check the box for family member, has this other, has, you know, these other terms. And you see there that you have to include the value and the terms of the interest as well. Okay. As we mentioned before, anywhere that you would be able to report information on the payment or transfer value report, it's going there. So this report would include anything from a GPO, because GPOs are not reporting on that first report. But for an applicable manufacturer, if this is a payment to a physician, as it's defined under the Social Security Act, it would go on the other report. If this relates to a physician owner or investor, which is broader, it doesn't have that employee exemption, those payments would go on this report. And again, this is a report that we're filing at the same time. We don't really have an exact template, but you know, we have this set of data elements that we know we need to be capturing.
when are the important dates? For all of us, the key date here is when data collection begins. August 1st, 2013, data must be captured through December 31st, 2013 to be reported for the first time. Both sets of reports are due on March 31st, 2014. Following that is the projected dispute resolution timeframe. We expect it will take place in summer 2014. However, the regulations and preamble don't provide for a specific time frame. Instead, it indicates that CMS will provide notification to both the applicable manufacturers, GPOs, as well as covered recipients when that projected dispute resolution will begin. The publication on CMS's website of the first reports will be published on September 30th, 2014. And then the first reports will be due to Congress by April 1st, 2015. Where will the information be posted? CMS will be creating a publicly available and searchable website. CMS does not provide specifics at this time regarding that website, other than to indicate that CMS will engage stakeholders and the public in the development process of the website. And the final website is intended to be user-friendly and provide accurate and understandable information to the public. And I know this is an area of concern for a lot of us. For true transparency to take place, the data has to be understandable and truly available to the public. And I think CMS is trying to address that by including the context field for applicable manufacturers to provide some background information for the purpose of the payment maybe in a more understandable fashion than nature would provide. CMS also intends to provide frequently asked questions that will help users understand the contextual information. So that is, again, CMS addressing the concerns of many in the industry that the data that would be provided to the public be understandable and the contextual information be provided. So how to register and certify to the report. Registration must take place before the submission deadline. So manufacturers and GPOs must register with CMS within 90 days at the end of the calendar year for which reporting is required. Part of registration includes naming 2 points of contact and providing their information. These contacts are not the individuals that will be certifying to the information, but instead would be the points of contact for the dispute resolution process. Also, with regard to registration, applicable manufacturers that fall within that paragraph 1 definition must register independently, even if they intend to submit a consolidated report. Attestation, the report must include an attestation. The final regulations include a broader category of individuals who can attest to the data being submitted as being true and accurate. A CEO, CFO, COO, as well as other officer are included as individuals who can attest to the data. CMS included other officer to recognize and accommodate for all business structures. One attestation is to be provided for consolidated reports. So the individual that's attesting to a consolidated report would be attesting to the full data being provided. So if 2 companies are submitting a report, one individual would be attesting to the full accuracy of both companies' data. So that's a key element to keep in mind, as well as that individual and company would be responsible for all penalties for both companies. So that's a huge area to keep in mind as you're making those agreements with companies to consolidate together.
And I actually just don't remember if we said it at the beginning talking about penalties, but that those caps are really per company, per applicable manufacturer. So just because you're submitting one consolidated report doesn't mean you're capped at $1 million for your knowing failures. if I'm the one submitting on behalf, or I'm the one attesting on behalf of this file, that's all well and good, but if it includes 5 different quote-unquote applicable manufacturers' data in there, we have the potential for an awful lot of penalties if there are issues.
Absolutely true. The attestation also includes if you are attesting to the fact that you fall within the 10% gross revenue limitation, that attestation takes place at that time. The assumptions document that I've referenced along the way is available to both the applicable manufacturers and GPOs. Such documentations can be submitted by either for both reports. The assumptions document is a voluntary document. It provides the opportunity for you to document your methodologies used to your valuation, what nature categories you are providing. CMS does not provide a template for what the assumptions document is expected to look like at this time. It's completely up to you as you prepare it, but it is voluntary. It will not be made available to the public, covered recipients, or physician owners or investors. It will be between the company and CMS. It provides information to CMS to help them identify areas where additional guidance or clarification is needed. So it's a potential opportunity to communicate with CMS where the regulations could be clearer and additional guidance is necessary. CMS also indicates that while these documents are not made public, they would be available to OIG, HHS, and DOJ as part of an audit or an investigation.
So it's not exactly safe, but
yeah, so they not public, but they can be made available.
Okay. So we're into the how. So how are we actually reporting this data? A lot of you remember in the proposed regulations there was basically what looked like an Excel form that showed, left to right what would be included on the report. We don't have that in these regulations and in these final regulations, or in fact in the preamble. But there's a discussion about the format and the general requirements. What CMS said basically was, we don't think it's appropriate to have that format in regulations and regulatory rules. That's something that is likely going to change, and we need to think about, and we need to get feedback on. So we'll be providing that separately. So right now, as far as data collection goes and preparing for August 1st, you need to be a little flexible. We have a really good idea, I think, of what's going to be required, and we think it's going to be a CSV format file that we submit through a portal, but we don't know. That just hasn't been finalized yet, so we'll have to sort of hold our breath on having the actual template done. I think they said that was something else that they would provide each year, 90 days pre-collection. So again, we would be looking at May of this year, by May 1st, but we'll see. The attestation goes with that file or files. If they did say that if you run out of room in file number 1, you can have another file to supplement. And they also said that if you don't have payments, if there's nothing that, you've done your due diligence, you don't have anything to report, you don't have to submit anything. Some of the states are either unclear or say that you have to send, something in saying we have nothing to report this year. CMS said you don't need to do that for us.
And no registration is required either.
Right, no registration either. One of the things that we find fascinating is that so far there's no fee that we know of. We actually took bets here about what the fee would be a long, long time ago, and we keep waiting and waiting, and there hasn't been any word about a fee that would go along with these filings. As you guys all know, in submitting your state reports, a few of them do have filing fees or annual fees to register. And I think maybe CMS is thinking this is so expensive and such a burden it would be inappropriate to assess a fee, but we'll see. It's also very expensive for the government, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind getting a few bucks from all the companies that will be submitting data. Neither here nor there. On the dispute side, so how do we deal with disputes? This is something, like we said, that was talked about in the proposed regulations. CMS requested comments, and a lot of folks did submit comments. It's ending up that there will be basically this 60-day period, a 45-day sort of dispute time, and then another 15 days where you can still be correcting data. So you couldn't, lodge a complaint or note a dispute at that point, but you would still have another 15 days to deal with talking with your covered recipient and correcting data. So the idea is that CMS is going to be notifying covered recipients that the data is available. They've said that they're going to, that covered recipients can register, so they would get an email address that way. They're also going to work with medical specialty or medical societies, work with the AMA and other organizations to provide notice to covered recipients. Covered recipients are going to be able to log in. We're not quite sure how that's going to work yet, but they say it will be secure, obviously, which it will need to be, and everyone will be able to only see data related to them. And the covered recipient can then initiate a dispute. They can say, all right, this line item doesn't look right to me. I want to flag it. And so there's going to be a process where the covered recipient can identify a particular transaction or line item as being in dispute. And from that process, a notification will go out to CMS to flag that transaction, that payment, and also to the manufacturer, the GPO. And from there, it's up to you guys, it's up to the covered recipients and the applicable manufacturers and GPOs to work it out. This is just a little visual of how it's going to work. Notification goes out when I'm sure it will be ahead of time saying, as of this date, everyone can log in and see all of the data. So at that date, everybody can go in. That's when that 45-day period begins. Anything that is not flagged as disputed within that 45 days moves forward and sort of is locked down at that point. Anything that is flagged as disputed, like I said, you'll have those 45 days and another 15 days to go back and forth and work out the kinks and let CMS know that, either it is in fact correct or here's the revised data. A note on that if you are revising data and resubmitting data, each time you do that, you're attesting to that data. So it's every single time is an attestation. It's a little unclear to me whether you would be submitting a whole file again or whether you can submit just sort of delta records, those changes. So we'll have to see about that. They don't go into how that would affect payments that you aggregated, those small payments, or payments that you're reporting on a single date that actually occurred over multiple dates. So, those kinds of details are just not laid out. If after those 45 and 15 days you haven't resolved the issue, the payment will get published to the public website. It will be the applicable manufacturer's version. So whatever you last submitted, that's what's going to get published. But it will have a flag with it saying that it's disputed. And you still can amend the data down the line. It's just that for that publication, it didn't make it. It didn't get revised in time for that publication. CMS said that they will do at least one other update during a year. So the publication, the first annual publication, and then at least one more time during the year, they will, sort of refresh the data with the updated information. But they're not promising to do it any more than that because obviously it could be a pretty big burden on them. Okay.
Another dispute resolution clarification or interest is that CMS will be monitoring the level of activity per applicable manufacturer to just to see if a company has large activity of disputed payments or not. They don't say what they would do with that information, but they do indicate that they will be monitoring that activity.
And another clarification is the concept of having an obligation on the part of the manufacturers and GPOs. They said in the final regs, the preamble, that you in fact don't have an obligation to do anything proactively, either before you submit data in March or before the publication date. CMS basically said, we understand that could be pretty burdensome, and it wouldn't likely have additional costs associated with it. But they, of course, said to the extent you can, it would probably be helpful. Obviously for them, the fewer disputes that have to be dealt with on their end and, with data changes and everything, of course, is a good thing. So, Sarah and I know from working with various companies that some companies are really trying to do something proactively, whereas other companies have said, no, we're not doing it. CMS is going to do it. That's enough. And go from there. So there are different options there, but from a requirement standpoint, no requirement. And then the big question at the end, on the preemption front, where are we? Not a whole lot was said in the final regulations here, the preamble about this. The CMS reaffirmed that the preemption provision is there, and to the extent that something is required to be reported federally, it's not required to be reported, or it can't be required to be reported at the state level. But they also clarify that there are types of payments or types of recipients, and even types of covered entities, covered reporting entities, that would not be preempted. So, we all know that in I think all of the states, there are quote-unquote covered recipients that are beyond the scope of physicians and teaching hospitals. There are other natures or other types of payments that might be subject to reporting. CMS also clarified that things that are exempted under the CMS regulations or under federal law, those are not preempted. So those things could still be subject to reporting at the state level. We know Maine took away its law years ago. Most of you probably have seen the notice from Minnesota that they are going to ask, that from the Board of Pharmacy, that they're going to ask the legislature to withdraw the law, the reporting requirements in Minnesota. And additionally, Vermont and Massachusetts have sort of gone the other way. They've both put out commentary or guidance in their departmental agency documents saying, we recognize that there's a preemption provision under federal law, and we're going to work with you, companies, to make sure that you don't have to duplicate report if you don't want to, but we're keeping our reporting requirement. So, you have to be sort of cognizant that while some laws may go away, others may not. We actually had a question from someone about this issue, and, not to get everybody nervous, but there are some states, we know Vermont recently, or I'm sorry, not Vermont, New York put out a bill to have a reporting requirement. So a new reporting requirement could come out, and there are other states that have those types of things in the works too. We think Connecticut may have a pending, or maybe putting together legislation as well. So, unfortunately, we can't write off the state reporting requirements yet. And in fact, now that we have final regulations, some of the states may say, well, now we know exactly what is preempted. We can make decisions about what to include in new legislation or amending our current legislation.
Or they might wait until the reports to the states are made and then evaluate if that information is sufficient for them, or if they would prefer the more expansive state requirements to remain in effect.
Right. So that's the end of our whirlwind 286-page review, or 286-page regulations summary. We hope you found it helpful. There have been a lot of questions submitted, and we will do our best to get back to everyone. If folks are willing to stay on the line for a few minutes, we can take a couple questions. But we understand folks have other meetings and places to be. So for those of you that are jumping off, we thank you for participating, and we hope you found this useful. The slide deck, again, for anyone who is a PCD, a Porzio Compliance Digest subscriber, it is already on the Porzio Compliance Digest in the Presentations tab. And if you are not a subscriber to the Porzio Compliance Digest, we're happy to get the deck to you. Just let us know. Okay? All right.
One question that did come through was specifically with regard to educational materials, inquiring if textbooks or journal reprints provided to physicians would fall within the educational materials exclusion. And those types of textbooks or journal reprints do not fall within the exclusion if they are provided to the physician for the physician's personal education, as opposed to being provided to the physician to be provided to the patient. So that's really the distinction for educational materials, whether they fall within the exclusion or not.
Someone submitted a question about how the manufacturer will learn of the dispute, of a dispute, and my understanding from the from CMS's comments here is that when the physician or covered recipient goes in and says, here's a little payment that I want to dispute, it sounds like it's going to basically create a form, and that form will allow the covered recipient to say, I'm so-and-so, here's my contact information, and submit it. And you remember Sarah mentioned that when you register, you have to provide contact information for 2 people. My understanding is that those people, or maybe one of them if it's a primary or something like that, I'm not sure, but those people will receive notice, and that will sort of be the initiation of the dispute process. So as you think about who you're going to include as your contact people, that's something to consider. Your CFO, your CEO may be doing the attestation, but they might not be the people that you want as the contact people and being inundated by disputes from, every doctor that you guys have ever worked with. Another question relates to the data points for the principal investigators who were reported with a research payment. Again, my understanding is that those are the same. So, a PI covered recipient, a physician, we're talking about the name as it appears in NPPES. We're talking about the specialty, the business address, and the specialty includes both the code and the description. We're talking about a state license number and a state of licensure. So it's all those same data points for identifying that, that physician or that covered recipient. Lots of questions about the deck. We will get the deck. Yeah, a couple questions about marketing materials. So thinking about, again, this is that educational materials exemption. It's pretty narrow, right? It sounds like those things are, the exemption is really limited to patient-focused things. So it's not necessarily something that has to physically go to the patient, but it has to be something used with the patient, a model or materials or a dosing calendar, maybe something that the patient will use, but something that we think may help the patient, but really is for the benefit of the physician, a journal subscription or marketing materials related to the product or something like that. To me, those things don't fall within that exemption, and as we said, unless it's exempted, it's reportable. So those things, it seems to me, are included. We deal with this at the state level, right, where we're reporting some of these things and how you're going to value them. So those issues will come up again, whether we're talking about production costs or printing costs or shipping costs and all those little sort of nuances of what's going to be included in a value. You know, we all, I think, agree for the most part that those sort of, you know, paper materials don't really have a fair market value, quote unquote. You know, they don't have a discernible economic value, like Sarah mentioned, is sort of the standard. So we're going to have to come up with a valuation, and again, probably something that you would think about including in your assumptions document if that's something that that you're going to include.
And again, I think that's where CMS's definition of or clarification of it be a reasonable and good faith effort to come up with the value. I think that as long as you're providing a reasonable and good faith effort to provide a value to it and document it in the assumption, I think that's the best approach.
Someone asked about the all-in rule. So when we have a requirement that, or the requirement that once you have a covered product, the general rule is that all of your payments, whether they relate to that or those covered products, are reportable. So yes, it relates to anything, and it also relates to anything that's not related to a product at all if it goes to a covered recipient. So it's very broad. As soon as you have that one product, you're sort of required to track everything, and that's why some of those exclusions are very helpful, because if your business is set up into different divisions, or if you're operating as separate companies, parent companies or subsidiary companies, where one is a quote-unquote applicable manufacturer under that first category and the others fall within a different, that second category, you might have some flexibility there with how to report, and then you might be able to report in a more limited manner only payments that relate to the covered products in some of the cases.
Yeah, I think CMS tried their best to limit the scope of the all-in as much as was reasonable from their point of view. So while the all-in remains in place, there is a little bit of limitation provided by CMS.
Sarah, we got a question about samples. You mentioned in the exclusion list that product samples, if they're for patient use, are exempted. What was the commentary that CMS included in the preamble about samples?
The preamble included that the definition of samples includes vouchers and coupons, those that had not been referenced before. So samples are excluded from the other payments report. However, the reporting requirement for samples remains in effect for the samples transparency reporting, which is separate and distinct from the requirements set forth that we've discussed today. So that remains in effect, and companies should continue to track and report that accordingly. And
we know, though, that report is on the drug side, right? So for device companies or companies that don't have prescription drugs, that doesn't apply to you. And the vouchers and coupons are not, at least as of yet, reported on that samples report. So there are some distinctions, but the qualifier that's in the regulations here is really related to real, the samples that are being given to doctors for passing on to patients to lower the cost of drugs, or to give, a sample of the product to be tried out before you do a 90-day supply, that kind of thing. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we will stop there. But again, we really thank everyone for joining us today. Sorry we went over for a few minutes, and thanks to everybody who hung in there. We hope you found this helpful, and please reach out to us if you have any questions. You see here Sarah has a Twitter account that she provides a lot of great information on, so we encourage you to follow her there if you're a Twitter user. And we also have our PharmAspective blog, which we post on pretty regularly and try and provide some good information to the industry. And if any of you will be at the Disclosure Summit next week, Sarah and I will be there, and we would love to see you, so please stop by. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.